And now I'd like to introduce the first speaker. Robert McNally is the founder of and the president of the Rapid Group, an independent energy consulting and market advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. Mr. McNally has served as the top international and domestic energy advisor on the White House staff. He'll explain why the oil market has entered a period of oil price volatility, as described in his book, Crude Volatility, The History and Future of Boom-Bust Oil Prices. Welcome to Copenhagen, Mr. McNally. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nuna. Thank you very much. And thank you to Oil and Gas Denmark for inviting me back to this beautiful city. It has been about 15 years since I've been in Copenhagen, and it's even more beautiful. The construction activity is incredible, and I'm really delighted to be here in an exciting time for energy policy here in Denmark and in Europe and around the world, energy policy and markets. What I'd like to do is I have some equipment. I have a lighter, a pointer, and I have my slide mover, and I'm going to move around a little bit with my equipment. What I'd like to do, though, is to sort of frame my message to you succinctly, if I can, and that is, it is a big mistake when making capital investment decisions or planning energy policy to believe in the following two English words: new normal. New normal. When you talk about oil prices, the new normal is $45 forever. This is a deep mistake. And this will be the thrust of my presentation to you. While my career involved a stint in the White House and the National Security Council and National Economic Council, most of my life professionally has been spent analyzing the oil market and analyzing policy and geopolitics. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of some views on the oil market and where we're going. But to do that, we have to look at history. Now, if this microphone is working, I'm going to try walking away. Good, the microphone still works. We have about 158 years of history, some economics and geopolitics to go through in about 20 minutes. I will try and talk slowly to not tax the interpreters too much, but I'm going to move along, and I do look forward to your comments and questions. Now, if you say, let's see here, is this going to click? I'm sure it will. Next. There we go. Now, if you say, well, Bob McNally is going to talk about volatile crude oil prices, but wait a minute, crude oil prices are always volatile. They always go up and down. And I'll show in a second, not like in the last 10 or 15 years they haven't. We haven't talked about that. They haven't gone up and down like we've seen recently. And this will lead to 3 points. First, I believe about 10 to 15 years ago, as evidenced in the oil price moves since then, a near quintupling in oil prices 12 years ago without a war in the Persian Gulf. Go back and check your price charts and ask yourself, when do oil prices ever do anything like spike almost fivefold in a few years without a war in the Persian Gulf? The answer is they don't. And then in 2014, just because OPEC had a difficult meeting in November, oil prices fell from $100 a barrel to $45, a 60% drop in 6 months without a recession, without a Chinese collapse or something. When does that happen? It doesn't. These price moves suggest we're in a new era, and that's what I'll explain. The second point is that while, in my view, we may not be done with the bust phase that began in 2014, I do believe that boom will follow bust, and oil prices in the next 3 to 5 years will be arcing toward $100 a barrel again. And finally, I'll conclude with my candidate for what I think the next big surprise in the oil market is. In my experience, every 5 years or so, there's some big transition, some big change in either supply or demand in the oil market that is about to hit us and completely change conventional thinking about oil price structure, price levels in coming years. And I'll give you my candidate for what that is. Okay. So the next slide is my favorite quote that I put in my book, that I think if you had to have one quote you listen to, you read every day to sort of understand how oil markets behave in the big picture, it would be this one from this British economist in 1937. The problem with oil is we have too much or not enough. Now let's think about that. What does he mean? Well, he's talking in 1937, looking back to 1859 until then, and the boom-bust periods and the stability that we've seen in the oil markets. What he's talking about are the intrinsic features of the oil market. Oil supply and demand do not respond quickly to price changes. They are sticky. On the demand side, oil is a must-have commodity for which there are no scalable substitutes. On the supply side, as you know, especially in the North Sea, oil investment is a long-term, multi-year, heavily upfront capital expenditure proposition. Once you sink that capital into those fields and those processing facilities, you don't turn off the oil supply because spot prices fall to a low level. Your operating costs are low. So when you have oil or any commodity for which demand and supply do not respond quickly to price changes, you have unbalanced markets, supply is ahead of demand, demand is ahead of supply, you get big price moves. You get inventory changes and then big price moves. The price has to swing far up or far down to convince that motorist to slow down or use less oil, or to convince that oil operator to cut back on production or shut in wells. That's what he was talking about. And I think it's important that we remember that now, and that's coming back to us. Okay, so let's go and let's talk about history. Now, when you say the history of the oil market, folks think, well, we start with the Arab oil embargo of 1973 because we all know nothing interesting happened in the oil market before October of 1973. I would respectfully disagree. I think to understand why oil prices have ranged from $145 to $26 last year, without wars, without recessions, we have to look before 1973. For my book, we put together a monthly continuous crude oil price series going back to 1859. And that chart on the inside here shows you that area. And what it shows you is that oil markets have gone through relatively very volatile periods, which I call boom-bust, exemplified by too much oil, the oil coming out of the derrick, and not enough, a scream from a motorist, or in this case, it would have been someone looking for some lighting to replace whale oil. And so we have these boom-bust eras. Now, this stickiness of oil and the boom-bust prices they create has been a terrible problem from the oil industry since the very first day. And to stop these boom-bust oil prices, we have seen three groups of producers enter and introduce flexible supply to control supply with the goal of stabilizing oil prices. The first was Mr. Rockefeller with Standard Oil. He couldn't believe it. He came in from Cleveland, Ohio to Western Pennsylvania, boom bust. Excessive drilling, too much oil, the price collapse, wipes out investment, demand goes up, the price goes back up again, boom bust, boom bust. He's a refiner, he can't stand that. So he brings order to the early oil industry by monopolizing the refining sector and cooperating or colluding with transportation, midstream in today's parlance. And he brought stability. Now we get into the 1900s and we don't like Mr. Rockefeller and we don't like rich trust magnates of his type. And so we busted up Standard Oil. I want to be clear, people were not angry at Mr. Rockefeller for his price manipulation. They liked his price manipulation. He made kerosene go global and he made it a household product. What they didn't like is he was a tycoon who used nefarious methods. So we bust up Standard Oil. After that, and this is very important, we had the last sustained period of boom-bust oil prices from World War I until 1932. Now, there was one big change, actually two, one in the oil market, one in policy circles. In the oil market, oil transitioned from lighting to transportation. And as a result, the governments got involved. So now, boom-bust oil prices aren't just a problem for the poor oil drillers and their investors. Now it's a problem for governments. Oil is a strategic commodity. It's winning wars. It was credited with winning World War I. It drives revenue. It drives jobs. It drives state budgets. It's important for monetary policy. It's important for defense policy. Governments care. These wild boom-bust periods scared government. During the boom of World War I, there was talk of nationalizing the oil sector. In the United States, the Navy was seizing oil from producers at gunpoint. We had rationing in California. People went crazy. We had the first peak oil scare. People said, we're running out. In 20 years, it'll be over. This terrified governments. But then the oil industry did something that the oil industry does very well, as you know well. It found a lot of oil. And it produced so much oil in Texas and Oklahoma that it crushed the prices. We went from not enough to too much. And oil prices collapsed. Now then, I have to say something happened in the early 1930s that caused me to question, and you'll pardon me, my religious beliefs. I don't want to get religious here, but I'm a Connecticut Yankee. I grew up in the north of the United States. But I worked for a Texas president. I have a lot of clients in Texas, and I've spent a lot of time in Texas. And if you spend time with Texas, what you will learn and what you will come to believe is that God put Texans on earth for at least two reasons. One is to find oil and gas. They're very good at it, as you know. You compete with them. Number two, they're very good at limiting the role of government and business decisions. In America, we generally trend towards free markets, but in Texas, they are the best at it. So imagine my surprise when I'm doing my research for my book, that I learned that in response to the oil price collapse of the early 1930s, the state of Texas and the oil industry, first of all, they declared a state of insurrection, sent armed troops into the fields to prod the drillers away from their wells. Then they implemented the most severe form of heavy-handed government intervention in any business I think that's ever existed on the planet. The Texas Railroad Commission, 3 commissioners, met once a month in the capital of Austin, Texas, and other oil states. And they dictated exactly how much oil private sector oil companies could drill or drillers could drill the next month. Had Mao Zedong seen this, he would have said, please, leave a little room for the private sector. This is embarrassing. This is a virulent form of communism. Why would Texas resort to communism? This is of more than historic interest. Bear with me. It matters for today and where we're going. Why? Because they hated boom-bust oil prices, and they knew how oil markets behaved. The Texas Railroad Commission was so successful that OPEC patterned itself after the Texas Railroad Commission. OPEC was founded by a Venezuelan fella who was oil minister in the 1950s, but during the 1950s, he became oil minister in the late 1950s. During the 1950s, Juan Perez Alfonso was in exile in the United States, and he went down to Texas, and he's like, this is amazing. Three officials get together once a month. They look at the numbers, supply, demand, inventory. They calculate a call on Texas, like a call on OPEC, and then they just tell the drillers how much they can produce. When he became an oil minister, he said, we should do this. He went to Saudi Arabia and took his colleague and said, we have to go to Texas. You have to see what the Americans are doing. This is incredible. And they kept oil prices very stable. Okay. We're going to go to the next chart. Now, bear with me a little bit. I want to just grind in a little bit more here on the lengths that governments will go with industry support to stabilize oil prices. It's a very busy chart. I can send it to you afterwards. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing. I want you just to focus on this line right here, okay? These 2 lines, actually, these brown lines. These lines show you what spare production capacity was, represented as total oil market production in the world. So, when a regulator tells you to shut in your well or to reduce the flow on your well, and you're at 100%, if you're ordered to go down to 70%, you have 30% of spare capacity. It is production capacity that you could be producing economically. You have the infrastructure, you have the customers, everything's fine. But because the regulator, or in the case of the Seven Sisters, the cartel that worked with the Texas Railroad Commission, they would control supply in the Middle East in a very similar way. You have spare capacity. Now, spare capacity is really good to have if you have an emergency supply interruption, a war or disruption, because you can increase production from there. Notice that in the early 1950s, total spare capacity in the world was 35%. Now think about that for a second. 35% of global crude oil production capacity was off the market because either Texas and U.S. oil states, about 25%, 20%, and then the Seven Sisters held it off. Why did they do that? They did that because in the 1950s, we were bringing on the huge Middle Eastern fields, but we didn't have the big boom in the roads and the cars in the 1960s. So we had too much. Going back to the too much, too little. We had way too much oil in the 1950s. Look how stable oil prices, that's that line there, stable. For historians, the 1950s is about the most boring decade in the whole world. Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Because you had regulators holding 35% off. Now this line, after 1972, it becomes OPEC. United States held most spare capacity, and we ran out in 1972. That's when modern oil markets began, not 1973. In 1972, the Texas Railroad Commission ran out of spare capacity. The chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission called it a damned historic occasion because he knew the United States was giving up 40 years of control. These are disruptions right here, just trust me. The Suez Crisis was the largest oil disruption in the history of the oil market. We don't ever talk about it. Why? Because Texas had extra and spare. They just increased production. In 1967, we had another war in the Persian Gulf, another disruption in oil markets. We don't talk about it. Why? Because Texas had spare. In October of 1973, there was a third war in the Persian Gulf. There was a small disruption. We talk about it. It changed our lives forever. Why? Because in 1972, Texas ran out of spare capacity. Long story short, we are now in a world in which spare capacity is very low. Very, very low, and it's probably all in Saudi Arabia. 1, maybe 2 million barrels a day at most. Very small. And that is a big challenge for the oil markets. When we have too much oil, as we do today, when you have low spare capacity, it means there's no swing producer. The job of the swing producer, like Texas, or now Saudi Arabia is supposed to be, is to cut production when there's too much, prevent big inventories, remove the risk of price drops like to $26 a barrel last year. Remove that risk. That's not happening. Spare capacity is low, production is high. Okay. So I took some, with my monthly crude oil price series, I have here the ranges for each year from high to low, and then I average them over these different eras that we're talking about. And I'll be happy to provide this with you, and the data, by the way, are free of charge. I provided that to the public. So boom bust 1, Mr. Rockefeller cuts the volatility in half. Boom bust 2, very, very difficult for governments and industry. Texas era, extremely strict control, very successful at stabilizing oil prices. OPEC came in, never as effective as Texas Railroad Commission, and now, folks, since 2008, we're out. In 1972, the United States lost control, but we handed it over to Saudi Arabia and OPEC. In 2008, Saudi Arabia lost control. We're handing it over to nobody. And in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about whether the current discussion of OPEC or agreements with Russia and so forth constitute supply management. In my view, I don't think they do. So, new normal. Well, let's see. The old new normal was oil prices would be from 18 to 40 or so, really about $25 forever. And then we had the big boom. Saudi Arabia lost control. No war, just supply exceeding demand, a bust. We had a few years of stability. Now, I think, I shouldn't say this because it's being videotaped. I'm not sure it's true, but I read somewhere that psychologists have said that if human beings are exposed to a phenomenon for 3 years, just need 3 years, they come to believe it's permanent. The world will always be that way. And so go ahead and Google new normal $100 oil and set the Google from like 2012 to 2014. And what you'll find here is that $100 a barrel was the new normal. Everybody believed we just got to get used to it. New normal. China wants to drive, high cost production, get used to it. Except we had a bust, and now everyone's starting to say the new normal is $45 a barrel. I'll disagree. This chart is to say And again, I think you'll like the message, the operators will like the message I have in the longer term. In the near term, I'm not so sure we're done with the bust. This shows you the buildup of inventories in the OECD, total crude oil inventories and products. And you see here the problem. If we had a swing producer back in 2014 and 2015, this would never have happened. This is exactly the thing that the Texas Railroad Commission and OPEC back in the early 1980s, when we had way too much oil, they would react to preemptively by cutting production. But we've had this very big buildup in inventories. Now this is a projection of inventories going forward that is based on official data and official forecasts. It is our view. It is not too dissimilar than the views of other public agencies or the implications of their analysis, and it shows that we're not out of the woods yet. This is why you've seen in the last month Saudi Arabia and Russia start to talk about maybe we need to extend that agreement to March. Maybe we need to extend it to January. Well, exactly. We've been waiting for the big liftoff in oil prices for several years. We've had false starts, and we're not out of the woods yet. Until those inventories come down, we've had a little bit of a reduction recently. We all better hope, for the sake of price stability, those inventories come back down. In our view, there's still a big risk of that. Okay, so I want to move on to the sort of the big surprise. Again, in my experience, every 5 years or so, there's something big happening or about to happen that no one realizes, that comes as a total shock. The last 3 big surprises came on the supply side with oil production. Here's an example, an illustration of the first one back in 2005, 2006, 2007. And those show you how the IEA, and they do a very good job, the best they can. This is not saying anything negative about the IEA. I respect enormously what they do and other people who try to count barrels. And the first thing, being a barrel counter and an oil price forecaster, you learn is that you need to be humble and you will make mistakes. But they are very influential. Everybody reads their reports and assumes this is the way the world will be. Well, in those years right there, that showed you how the IEA continually overestimated how much oil supply there would be outside of OPEC, while oil prices, the dotted line, was rising. It was just a picture of the consensus learning that, as we used to say, the era of easy oil is over, and that the supply curve was a lot steeper than we thought it was. Of course, this triggered peak oil fears. We're running out, just like it did in the 1920s. I mean, this comes around and around and around. Whenever the oil prices go up and we see supply disappointing, everyone says we're going to run out. So that was the big surprise back then. The next surprise that came along about 7 years ago was the US shale oil revolution. That caught everybody by surprise, perhaps except the US shale companies. God knows I was surprised by it. And this is illustrated by changes in the US Energy Information Administration's forecast of oil. Big change. The most recent big surprise in 2014 was that Saudi Arabia is not going to be the swing producer. Go back and pull up all the reports from the middle of 2014 and go back and look what everybody was saying. Everybody was saying oil price would be $95 forever. And because we had a lot of new oil coming from the United States and Brazil and Russia, OPEC was going to have to cut production in 2015, 2016, 2017. And that really meant Saudi Arabia is going to have to cut production, because Saudi Arabia is the only country that has ever really cut production in a healthy market. That's what everybody thought. And folks were completely surprised in November at the OPEC meeting in 2014 when Saudi Arabia said, we will not. And that's why oil prices collapsed. Oh my God. That's like having someone seeing a fire in a city, and you call the fire department and you say, there is a fire, you need to send trucks to the fire, because if you don't, the fire will spread and hurt many other buildings. And the fire department saying, we're not coming today. We're done being the fire department. $45 and then $26. Okay. My candidate for I'm always asking myself, what's the next big surprise? What's the thing we're missing? I could be wrong, but I ask myself that. I think it's going to be on the demand side. I think the very fashionable idea of peak demand for oil, especially near-term peak demand, is wrong. And not that I wish it, I'm saying what I think as an analyst. I think it's wrong. And if I'm right, then this is going to help create the next big boom. There's two things that are going to create the next big boom in oil prices. One, I think a lot of us talk about, and that is the collapse in investment in higher cost conventional oil production. That we're seeing, you're seeing it, you're aware of it, the companies here are aware of it. We don't have to talk about that too much. There's no question but that, especially E&P, budgets are being slashed, and we're going to have less new production and higher decline rates in coming years. I think that's uncontroversial. The question is whether that matters. The conventional view is that doesn't really matter for two reasons. One, shale oil is going to be the new swing producer. There's going to be so much U.S. shale oil that we don't need North Sea. We don't need Brazil. Certainly don't need Russian shale. Arctic, we don't need any of that. We're good at about 45, 50 bucks. We'll get all the shale we need. And the second reason is peak demand. Everyone's going to be driving electric cars in a few years. You don't understand. We're all going to public transportation. We're going to ban cars. We're going to have electric vehicles, and demand for oil is going to collapse. So those two things are going to keep oil at $45 forever. All right. I respectfully disagree. I'll start by saying none of the official agencies agree with this, at least from the terms of global total oil market demand. And this is the Energy Information Administration, so my Department of Energy's long-term forecast. They just published it, and we threw these slides in at the last minute. It just came out last week. And as you see here, and I don't think this is too dissimilar from the IEA or OPEC's forecast, they see total oil demand growing to well over 100 million barrels. Now, when we talk about a peak in demand for oil, it's more accurate or perhaps more reasonable to say that'll happen in the OECD. Yes. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. But everyone agrees the demand outside the OECD is growing, or the official agencies do. So here's an interesting, on the one hand, you have some folks saying it's peaking soon, we're going to peak soon. The barrel counters, the folks whose job it is to try to be accurate, and who at least can collect more information, better information about technology and markets and consumer preferences and policies and things, they seem to disagree. I think that's important. Another thing, too, I always like to analyze the analysts. The folks who are creating the conventional wisdom that we are all investing on and betting on. How are they changing their views? Because the only thing we know about a forecast, my forecast, the IEA's forecast, EIA's, the only thing we know for sure about anybody's forecast is that it's wrong. It's the only thing we know. Mine too. No one can forecast perfectly. So I always try to find, where are they learning? What new things? And so we like to look at how the official agencies are changing over time. And I think it's interesting that if you look at per capita oil demand forecast, so how much we think per head will be consumed, it's growing from year to year. It's been growing. And you see that here in the non-OECD. First of all, in 2015, actual demand turned out to be 17% higher than it was forecast in 2010. And then if you look forward to 2020 and 2025, what this shows you is how the forecasts are changing from 2017 forecast to 2010. It's getting higher. It's getting higher in India. It's getting higher in China. Now, there's one place where it's getting lower. And boy, it better, because there's no way we can have peak demand if the OECD doesn't slow down. Folks are becoming more pessimistic about oil demand in the OECD. I think that's an important question to ask ourselves. Why is that? I think a lot of it has to do with policy. We assume that governments are going to impose subsidies, mandates, incentives to drive consumption away from fossil fuels in transportation. By promoting, now it's very fashionable for electric cars. I notice if you've been around a long time, there's a certain circularity to it. Things come around every 5 years. And when I was in the White House, we were all about hydrogen cars, and then we went to ethanol. Now we're back to electric cars, but this kind of goes around. I mean, the first cars were going to be electric in the 1800s. I mean, there's a certain circularity to it, but now it's going to be electric cars. And I don't want to focus on the US too much here, except for this reason. If we're right about peak demand, when will we know it? And if we're wrong, when will we know it? When will folks, especially the consensus-forming agencies, be forced to confront their forecasts about peak demand in the OECD? My candidate is watch the United States. This is the Department of Energy's forecast of gasoline demand. You will notice it's collapsing. 1 in 9 barrels is consumed by US motorists and the world. So if those motorists are going to see a collapse in demand, this will be a sign that the OECD is slowing down. It'll raise confidence in the peak demand forecast, at least for the OECD, et cetera. If this happens, folks, this will be the first time oil demand in the United States has ever gone down without a recession. That will be a historic event, because this is not, if we have a recession, well, of course, demand will go down. That happened in the past, comes back. That's not what they're forecasting. This is about fuel economy regulations and California's electricity vehicle mandates. I can go on for a long time, and I will in the Q&A, about US regulations. But I was deeply involved in this in the White House. We watch it very closely. We've done a big study on it. Take this from me. There is no way US fuel economy regulations and California electricity mandates are going to drive the consumer away from oil. No way. They don't work that way. I'll leave it at that and invite questions. The problem is that the consumer, here you see the weight of cars that are being bought, and here's the price of gasoline. When both are rising, they're both rising together. But when the price of gasoline fell, consumers are buying heavier cars, and politicians aren't going to reverse that trend, in my view. All right, I'm going to skip ahead to 2 final points about why I think boom will follow bust, in addition to demand being much stronger than folks expect, including in the OECD. The first is inventories. This shows you crude oil inventories going back to World War I. This is commercial. These are strategic. These are inflows. Those are draws. What you see here is a nice history. In the beginning of the transportation sector, we were filling oil inventories like mad. This is the United States. Texas Railroad Commission comes in, keeps things stable. There's spare capacity. No need for big inventory. We lose control. We fill like maniacs our strategic stocks and our commercial stocks. My point with this is to make a point about China, India, Middle East, and other Latin American consumers. They're all going to do the same thing we did. They're going to fill for commercial storage. They're going to fill for strategic storage, but they're going to do it in a much tighter market. Final point on geopolitics. This is our estimate. We do an estimate of disrupted barrels and threatened barrel. Disrupted is dark, threatened is red. Here's our forecast. The good news is we think the world's become more peaceful. We hope so. We're analyzing it. The bad news is the spare capacity down here, that offset, that emergency supply if you need it, is going to remain low. Saudi Arabia is not investing in upstream production capacity. And so we don't see that growing too much. So we better have a friendlier world, because if we don't, oil prices are going much higher. And then my second to final slide, and I'm going to go very quickly. Statoil has a wonderful energy perspectives they release. I put this chart up here to sort of symbolize the core challenge we have and you have. And that is, here's demand for oil as they see it, the range. Here's production falling from existing fields. That's the gap that has to be filled from investment from your companies. And we're doing it without a Rockefeller, without a Texas Railroad Commission, and in my view, without an OPEC. So to conclude, when you have an unbalanced market and no swing producer, you get boom-bust oil prices. That's what we have now. You can have a few years of stability, but then you have shocking moves. I think we have to prepare for that. US shale is not going to replace Saudi Arabia, and I think boom will follow bust. With that, talk, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McNally. I have a few follow-up questions, and there might be a few questions from the floor. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand, and I think the microphone will move about in the room. But let me just talk to you about OPEC. I get the picture that you think basically OPEC is no longer in control. Is there any way OPEC can sort of regain that control?
It is theoretically possible, but I doubt it, and we see no sign of it. I think we'd have to see in the current market Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries, but really Saudi Arabia, because we have to realize Saudi Arabia has been the only producer willing to do the hard work, and so by cutting production, and we don't see that yet. The production cuts have been too small. And secondly, I think we'd have to see Saudi Arabia invest more in total production capacity in addition to downstream. That would backstop its pledge to be a guarantor of price stability. We don't see any of those two things, so I would be doubtful.
Mm-hmm. What are the results?
I'm sorry?
What are the results?
The results will be more boom and bust swings. Prices will have to swing between demand destruction on that top and shut-in prices on the low. And the top demand destruction for a commodity like oil is probably well north of $100. And shut-in prices, folks here have a better sense of that than me, but for marginal high-cost production to shut in, not to drop investment in new fields, is probably well below $30, if not $20. Mm-hmm. I think we'll see those ranges.
And there's basically nothing we can do about it if Saudi is not willing to, as you say, do the hard work.
We have to learn to live with it. We need more inventories. We need more hedging. We need probably companies are going to integrate more. We need to make smart policy decisions, not dumb ones. And dumb policy is always a risk with these kind of big swings. So there are coping mechanisms I think we can use, but there is no ultimate solution like we saw with the Texas Railroad Commission or OPEC, in my view.
Mm-hmm. So a few words about peak oil demand, because it seems to be a common knowledge also in the sector that it's rather a when than whether, and you sort of you contradict this, but basically you've told us why you don't believe in it. But the thing is, we don't know. There are lots of things we don't know, and I must admit you really take that into consideration. But we don't know how the political will develop. We don't know how tough regulation on emissions will be. We don't know how the political system will sort of drive the changes, and I guess that sort of makes it even more difficult to see in the future.
Yeah, it does. But there are a few things we do know. We know that energy transitions take decades.
But does it have to do that?
Unless there is a cheap and scalable alternative, it really does. We've invested trillions in this infrastructure. We're not going to get rid of it overnight. Also, other than wartime, I don't see examples of where governments are willing to put in place strong enough policies to induce the kind of transitions we're talking about. There's a German climate advisor who has called for what he says is an induced implosion of the hydrocarbon economy. I think he's right. If you want to really achieve these fast transitions, I think you almost have to drive the hydrocarbon economy into a ditch at whatever cost. I don't think elected officials or even unelected officials will do that anywhere on the planet. So I think we have to, and I don't mean to downplay the risk of climate change or the seriousness with which people take climate change. That is not my point. My point is I think folks overlook the scale, the time scale, and the scale of investment that has been sunk into the hydrocarbon energy industry, how important that is for safety, security, and economic viability, and how slow it will be to change, given that we don't yet have a scalable alternative to the internal combustion engine and fossil fuels in transportation. We just simply don't.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because we have seen within all the technologies that the third world can sort of skip some of the processes we've been through here when it comes to telephones and all that. So they basically don't need the traditional infrastructure. And I guess some of this can go for the technological development within transportation as well. But I admit it does take some time. But maybe they can do it quicker than we did.
Yeah. Maybe. You can't rule anything out, but I don't think we should expect it with energy as we did with microprocessors or cameras or telephone systems. They're extremely different. And at the end of the day, folks I hear some folks take a picture of New York City in 1910 and then New York City in 1913. And in 1910, you saw nothing but horses. And in 1913, you saw nothing but cars. And you say, well, why can't we? Why? Well, the reason we did 1913, that transition, is because we developed the fuel resources, and then we invented the technology to use the fuel, which presented an overwhelming improvement for transportation to the public. Had nothing to do with government policy whatsoever. When you look at electric cars, notwithstanding the big increases in efficiency and falls in production costs, and the subsidies and efforts that are putting in place to push them, they are still less than 0.1% of the vehicle stock. And they're not sufficient to drive the kind of transitions we're talking about so that demand would peak in 2020 or 2030. Look at where the car sales are in China. They're for light trucks and SUVs. In the United States, it's certainly the case. So I just don't think we have the data, the historical experience to expect that governments are going to be able to drive this transition very fast.
So are you saying I don't believe in the peak oil demand, or I'm not going to make a forecast? I'm not going to make a wild guess on when?
Well, at some time, oil demand will peak. What I say is I don't believe in the widespread conventional wisdom that it's going to peak in the next 5 to 10 or even 15 years. And when that's disproven, combined with this underinvestment, in the supply side, we're going to have a boom.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's see if there's any questions from the floor. Yeah, there's one question up here. There'll be a microphone shortly.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Mr. McNally. I was interested in the comment you made regarding Saudi Arabia's expected reluctance to invest in the coming years and how this would drive the oil price development. Now, as we know, there are several countries in Africa, in the Middle East, Iraq, and not least Iran, that are investing and that will be investing, and certainly the combination of the volumes that they're going to be producing should be greater than what would have come out of Saudi Arabia. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I think the question of Saudi Arabia is key because Saudi Arabia is different from all other producers on the planet. It's the only country that, at least in history, has been willing to play that swing producer role, to bear the burden of almost unilateral production cuts, like the Texas Railroad Commission ordered, to keep prices stable. No other producer really does that. And so we have to ask ourselves, is Saudi Arabia investing in upstream production capacity to increase it? And they are not. They say they are not. They could, but they're not. They're choosing to invest downstream in refining and petrochemicals, which makes sense if you want to ride the boom-bust cycle, not manage it. So I think that's why Saudi Arabia is so important. And as you well know, when you think about production growth outside in other countries, that's all very important and very good. But as you know, decline rates, as the Statoil chart indicated, are very large. So we need to replace 6-7 million barrels a day of production a year from declines. So we need every drop. Meanwhile, investment budgets for these projects are falling around the world. And so I think the Saudis have expressed a concern, and they're absolutely right, that one of the consequences of the bust is that it is disincentivizing investment we will need to prevent the next boom. They do not want to see boom-bust oil prices. But so I think, but the question is whether will they invest in their production capacity and be willing to adjust supply, and so far the answer is no.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A final question from the audience? Yep.
Yes, sir.
The demand side doesn't seem to be an issue from your perspective in the 10 to 15 year horizon. How do you see the swing producer in the unconventional world when you think about the cost price ranging around $45, $50 where investors can bring on production in maybe 5-6 months, right, versus the underinvestment on the long circle? How do you see that balance in terms of the timing of the boom?
Right. I'm almost tempted. Oh, the slides are gone. The jury is still out, and we're still learning about shale. We know a couple things for sure, though. Shale oil is not as flexible as Texas Railroad Commission or OPEC, which can act within weeks and durably. Shale oil production kept rising in the United States for 3 to 5 months after oil prices collapsed, so by no means is it as fast. It also can't operate at scale because our law prohibits companies from cooperating in this way. They would all go to jail if the shale oil companies did this. So I think we know the shale oil companies cannot be a sort of a traditional swing producer. And then let's look back at recent price history. They've been both a stabilizing and a destabilizing force. When oil prices headed towards $145 and then collapsed and then went back to $100 a barrel in 2010, that's when shale oil production came on. And it was just in time. Arguably, shale oil production growth helped cap prices below $120 as prices recovered, especially with the disruptions in Libya and Iran and so forth. It was much needed. So there you could argue shale oil arrived just in time. But then look at the 2014 price collapse. That was in part caused by shale oil production. The Saudis looked at this and said, the Americans are going to increase 1 million barrels a day a year, then the Brazilians and the Russians and everybody else, and I'm going to have to cut my production to offset that? The fire department is not coming today, and that's what led to the price collapse. So history has shown we've seen both. And in the future, I don't think, and it's always a mistake to bet against U.S. shale oil companies. I think they'll produce more at lower cost with better technology than even we expect. However, it's not enough to keep 100 million barrel a day market stable, in my view.
Mr. McNally, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.